Hi, everybody. This is Mr. Molina. In ancient Greek times, there was a group of thinkers known as the Sophists. These thinkers were quite popular in ancient Greece, especially in Athens, because they claim they can make any argument right and wrong. They can prove anything as truth, or certain, and then take the same idea and prove it wrong and false. Basically, they said that there's no absolute certainty, there's no absolute knowledge about anything in the world. Everything is relative in their view. So they would ask their followers, their audience, they would say, let's just come up with any position about anything, and they would say, okay, let's take for example the gods, whether the gods are the source of morality and justice. And they would start saying, well, let's start with an affirmative position on the issue. Let's say the gods are the source of morality and justice. And then they would provide arguments and reasons and evidence, and they would appeal to their myth to actually show and prove that the gods were indeed the source of justice and morality. And once the audience was convinced, they would say, well, now we're going to take the opposite position. Now we're going to show you, we're going to prove to you that the gods are not the source of morality and justice. And then they would provide reasons, arguments, evidence. They would appeal to their religion, mythology, and so on. And then they would establish conclusively that the gods were not the source of morality and justice. So they were quite popular because that was, if you think about it, that was an amazing realization that nothing is it's certain in the world. Well, Socrates was the first philosopher who proved that this sophists, they were full of it. They were confused about their ideas. They were wrong in many ways. Plato, a disciple of Socrates, actually Socrates' most important famous disciple, Plato came up with a theory in order to prove that we do indeed have knowledge. We can have knowledge, certain knowledge and knowledge of truth. And he came up with his theory of the forms. But it was Aristotle, a disciple of Plato, who came up with a system in which you can actually prove that some arguments were simply wrong by considering the structure of the argument. This system I'm talking about, friends, it's logic. So Aristotle was able to develop this system of logic in which you can recognize good from bad arguments in order to be sure that we're in the right path when it comes to attaining knowledge and certainty. So Aristotle started with breaking down arguments into very, very simple components, very basic components, like a statement. And today I want to talk to you about some of the most simple form of arguments that Aristotle was able to prove that they were not, that some of them were right and a different type of arguments were simply wrong, by simply paying attention to the structure of the argument. And this is very important, which is why I'm putting together this video. There's a lot of confusion about logic and what are we paying attention really. So hopefully this video will help you clarify any doubts that you might have regarding this lesson, the lesson on logic. So first of all, arguments. What is a philosophical argument? Okay, an argument must have at least two parts: the premise, at least one premise, and one conclusion. There's only one conclusion in every argument. Now, an argument can have more than one premise. You can have two, three, multiple premises and one conclusion. A premise is simply the evidence you're providing to show that your conclusion is actually true. Okay? So that's all there is. A premise is evidence. So an argument in its most simple form, it's something like, I wear green because it's my favorite color. So that is an argument if you think about it. The conclusion is, and the conclusion being the part of the argument that I want my listeners to believe, the piece of information that I'm trying to convey, and I'm trying to say this is certain, this is true. I'm wearing green because now introduces a reason, evidence that supports my conclusion. Because is my favorite color. Green is my favorite color. So if you think about it, that simple statement, it's an argument. The I'm wearing green being the conclusion, green is my favorite color being the premise, the evidence I'm providing. Now, this is just an example, but this is how we communicate. This is how we try to let people know that, you know, we're trying to share some truth about ourselves or about the world, right? When we use a statement with that, with because. Now, so we need at least one premise and just only one conclusion. The arguments we're going to consider today, we're going to consider four types of arguments: two that are valid and two that are invalid. What makes these arguments valid or invalid? It's, once again, the structure of the argument. Now, the arguments we're going to consider, they all have a conditional as the first premise. Okay, so we're just considering just a very specific category of arguments. Arguments having a conditional as a first premise. A conditional is if A, then B. That's a conditional. If X, then Y. If you have wings, then you can fly, for example, right? Any condition of this nature, right? It's a or any if then statement, it's a conditional. So, for example, let's just put it here. If A, then B. Okay, and here I'm using symbols, logic symbols, right? That arrow there, it's the symbol for the conditional. If A, then B. We have two terms here, right? In logic. This is all explained in our PowerPoint. But the first term, the A term in this case, it's called the antecedent. And this term, it's called the consequent. Antecedent, consequent, right? Think about the consequence, right, of A. It's one way to make it easier to remember what these terms mean. Antecedent and consequent. So that's a conditional. If A, then B. If X, then Y, whatever. If you have wings, then you can fly. I want you to I want today to pay attention to two structures, two arguments out of four in the PowerPoint. I'm just going to explain two, one valid, one invalid structure. So let's say this is the first premise, the first evidence, a conditional, if A, then B. And then I say, as my second premise, A, and my conclusion being B. Now, you see those three dots, right? That's the logic symbol for therefore. So that symbol introduces a conclusion. So that is an argument. Two premises, one conclusion. Premise one, if A, then B. Premise two, A, conclusion B. The example that I'm using in the PowerPoint is if it rains, that's my A. All the cars outside are going to get wet. Or the cars outside, let's say, to make it more more certain, right? Because we're looking for certainty. If it starts raining, cars outside are going to get wet. We can say that's a pretty solid statement, right? If it starts raining, cars outside are going to get wet. That's my first proof. My second proof, my second premise. It is raining. Conclusion, cars outside are getting wet. That is a valid argument. Based on what? Based on the structure. If A, then B, A, therefore B. That argument structure is called modus ponens. Okay, so these are terms that you have to remember for this first lesson on logic. Modus ponens, it's an argument structure that it's always valid. Remember, there's no room for relativity here. This is why Aristotle came up with logic, right? To defeat this idea that everything is relative. No, this will give you absolute certainty. There is a different argument structure that you know for a fact. Once you recognize the argument structure, it's not good. It's not going to give you certainty. Okay, and it's this structure. First, conditional, if A, then B. Okay, same first premise, right? Just a conditional. Premise 2, B, therefore A. Now, this is an invalid structure. This kind of argument, this kind of structure, it's not going to give you certainty. You're going to get in trouble here. You're not going to obtain knowledge, true, reliable knowledge. And here's why. We're using the same conditional. If it rains, cars outside are going to get wet. Premise 2. Cars outside are wet. Therefore, it is raining. So logic tells us that this is wrong because of the structure. Our second premise is the consequent. And then we are concluding the antecedent. Now, I think you can tell why this is not a reliable structure. Think about it. If it rains, cars outside are going to get wet. The cars outside are wet, therefore it is raining. Okay, think about it. Cars outside can be wet for different reasons, right? Maybe it's morning dew, for example, right? Especially when there's high levels of humidity, in the morning, you're going to find the cars outside wet, but that does not mean that it's raining or it has rained. Or maybe they are wet because of their sprinkler system and some cars are wet. Or maybe you can find another reason. So, yes, it seems possible, right? If we step outside and we see all the cars wet, it seems logical, it seems, to assume that it was raining. It might be true, but simply by using that structure, that argument structure, that's not absolutely certain. You cannot be absolutely certain that it was actually raining simply by looking at the cars being wet. So this is your job, right, in this lesson. There's two more arguments that we're not going to consider here because we don't have enough time. But there's basically two valid argument structures and two invalid structures that you need to be mindful of. But they're very similar because they all start with a conditional. If A, then B. Now, this invalid structure, it's called affirming the consequent. Affirming the consequent, because that's what our second premise is doing. The second premise is affirming of these two terms. We are affirming the second term, the consequent. So that's the name of the argument, the invalid structure. Affirming the consequent, always invalid. Modus ponens, or affirming the antecedent, always valid. And this is the last thing I want to talk to you about. The difference between validity and soundness. Now, give me all your attention here, because this is the trickiest part, the most confusing part of this lesson. Validity and soundness are not the same. You can have a valid structure and an unsound or terrible argument. What do you mean, Mr. Molina? Okay, I mean this. If I come up with this condition, if I start singing, there'll be no more conflicts in our planet. Okay. I am singing right now. La la la. That means we won't have more conflicts in our planet. We're living right now in a peaceful world. Okay, you might say, rightfully, Mr. Molina, that's silly. That's pretty dumb. Well, yes. What's dumb is the first premise, the conditional. It's a very silly conditional. If I start singing, I'm gonna make this world a better place, right? There won't be more conflicts in the world. Okay, that's a very silly conditional. But the structure I'm using for my argument, it's valid. So my argument is actually valid, logically speaking. If I start singing, I'm gonna make this world a better place. I'm singing right now. I'm singing. That means now we're living in a better world with no wars, no conflicts. That's a valid argument, friends. But it's not sound. And that's the key. It's not sound because my first premise, my conditional, is very, very questionable. Right? How can you be sure about that, right? So when you have a questionable premises, when your first conditional, your first premise, your conditional is questionable, then you can have a valid argument, but not a sound argument. And ideally, what we're looking for, friends, is both validity and soundness. Because once we have those two together, then we can have absolute certainty. We can have absolute truth. Just like my first argument, if it starts raining, cars outside are going to get wet. Not every single car, but just cars in general, right? You can even say some cars are going to get wet. Absolutely. That's absolutely true, right? If it starts raining, at least in the city, you might think, okay, maybe that's questionable. That's not absolutely entirely true, that conditional. Okay, well, think about a different conditional, right? If Bobby is a dog, then he's a mammal. If Bobby is a dog, then he's a mammal. Bobby is a dog. Therefore, he's a mammal. Okay. That's pretty solid, don't you think? Solid. Now we have a solid conditional. But if we put it in an invalid structure, see what happens. If Bobby is a dog, then he's a mammal. Bobby is a mammal. Therefore, Bobby is a dog. No, wait a minute. If your second premise is Bobby is a mammal, you cannot conclude that Bobby is a dog because there's many different kinds of mammals. So okay, I hope you see it. Okay, so yes, you have a good conditional, but the structure, you can tell it's evidently not good. It works. That argument works here, in a valid structure. Now, be aware of this because you're going to have it on your quiz, right? You're going to have these questions on a quiz. You're going to see arguments, premise one, conditional, and then second premise, something like this, just one term, and then a conclusion. And you're going to see the argument like makes perfect sense. Absolutely, you're going to say, okay, this makes a lot of sense, but the structure, it's invalid. And you have to be able to recognize that. And you're also going to have questions where you see an argument that is absurd. It's just silly, but it has a valid structure. And you have to be able to recognize that. You're not looking at the silliness of the argument, but at the structure. So pay attention to what the question is asking you to find. Validity or soundness. So pay attention to that. There are two different things. I can give you a very silly conditional in a valid structure, and I will have a valid argument, even though it's silly. So I hope that makes this lesson a little easier to understand. Remember, you can always use the weekly forums in case you have a question. In our PowerPoint, I had some weekly forum practice, and you're more than welcome to answer some of those questions or try to practice using the weekly forum, and then hopefully many of you will jump in and participate and try to see if the argument you're providing is good, it's valid, invalid, sound, unsound, and so on. So I encourage you to use the weekly forum in that sense, so you can practice these ideas, because they might seem easy at first to understand, to grasp. Some of you can go like, oh, okay, I got this. This is not too complicated. But trust me, when you see other examples, when you have different conditionals, it can get tricky. So be careful with that. Pay attention to the structure and understand the difference between validity and soundness. Okay, that's it for me. Once again, I'm always available for questions. Use the weekly forum and get some participation points. See you next time.